"Officer Miller, is that your final testimony?" The voice was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the oppressive humidity of the courtroom like a shard of ice. He thought it was over, but he had no idea this woman was about to rewrite the law. The hallway of the county courthouse smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing drone, casting a jaundiced glow on the scuffed linoleum floors and beige, water-stained walls. It was a place designed to diminish people, to grind them down with bureaucratic indifference until they accepted their fate. Imani Hayes sat on a hard wooden bench, her posture perfectly straight, a stark contrast to the weary slump of everyone else waiting for their turn in the machine. She wore a simple, charcoal gray suit that looked like it had been purchased from a department store sale rack, a size too big in the shoulders. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and behind a pair of plain, functional glasses, her eyes were calm, observant, and missed nothing. To the world, she was just another overworked, underpaid public defender, another cog fighting a hopeless battle. That was the point. The disguise was a weapon, and she wielded it with the patience of a sniper. A heavy, rhythmic thudding of polished leather on tile announced his arrival. Officer Frank Miller rounded the corner, his uniform crisp, the brass on his belt gleaming under the sickly light. He was a bull of a man, with a thick neck that strained against his collar and a face ruddy with self-satisfaction. Medals and commendations adorned his chest, a carefully curated display of authority and heroism. He walked with a swagger that owned the space, his eyes sweeping over the downtrodden faces with casual contempt. This was his kingdom. These were his subjects. His gaze landed on Imani and the young man sitting beside her. A sneer, practiced and ugly, twisted his lips. He saw exactly what he expected to see: a scared kid and his helpless lawyer. Another easy win. Jamal, Imani's nephew, was barely 19. He was a good kid, a scholarship student, in his first year of engineering, but right now he just looked terrified. His hands were cuffed in front of him, his oversized orange jumpsuit swallowing his thin frame. He had been pulled over for a broken taillight, a stop that had somehow escalated into charges of resisting arrest and assault on an officer. The inciting incident had happened less than an hour ago in the sterile booking area downstairs. Away from the public cameras, Miller had shoved Jamal against the wall. "Think you're a tough guy, huh, boy?" he had snarled, his face inches from Jamal's. "Think you can look at me like that?" Jamal, raised by Imani to be respectful, but not subservient, had simply held his gaze, refusing to be broken. That silent defiance had enraged Miller. The officer had leaned in close. "You're nothing," he had whispered. Then he had spat. A thick glob of saliva had hit Jamal's cheek, a profound act of degradation that was meant to shatter him completely. Imani had seen it all from the visitor's partition, her heart turning into a cold, hard knot of fury in her chest. She had made no sound, given no reaction. She had simply watched, her mind a whirring engine of cold, calculating logic, cataloging the offense, filing it away. This was the final piece of data she needed. Now in the hallway, Miller sauntered over. Stopping directly in front of them, he deliberately ignored Imani, focusing his full, intimidating presence on Jamal. "Ready for your big day, thug?" Miller's voice was a low growl, meant to carry just far enough for them to hear. "Gonna cry for the judge? Tell him how mean the policeman was?" Jamal flinched, but Imani placed a steadying hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it carried an impossible weight of reassurance. "Look at me, Jamal," she said softly, her voice never rising. "Do not look at him." Miller's sneer deepened. He finally deigned to look at Imani, his eyes dripping with condescension. You, his lawyer? Good luck with that. This one's a slam dunk. He tapped his chest where a small body camera was clipped, currently inactive. Him getting violent, me defending myself. He's going away for a long time. He was lying. He knew he was lying, but the lie was his shield, his sword, and his gospel. In his world, his word, backed by his uniform, was truth. From Miller's perspective, this was just another Tuesday. He saw a young black man and immediately sorted him into a pre-labeled box, criminal. He saw a woman in a cheap suit and saw another bleeding heart public defender he could walk all over. His brain, clouded by years of unchecked power and prejudice, didn't register the stillness in her eyes or the dangerous precision in her posture. He saw weakness. He saw an easy victory. The bailiff called Jamal's case. His voice bored and tinny as they stood. Miller stepped closer, invading Imani's personal space. "Maybe after this, you and I can go for a drink," he murmured, his breath smelling of stale coffee and arrogance. "You can tell me all about how you lost." Imani didn't respond. She simply guided Jamal toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, her expression as placid and unreadable as deep water. The trap was not yet set, but the bait was chosen, and the animal was hungry. Inside the courtroom was an oppressive cathedral of varnished wood and worn-out justice. The air was thick and still, heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 ruined lives. High on his judicial throne sat Judge Arthur Thompson, man whose patience had been eroded by decades of listening to what he considered pathetic excuses. His face was a permanent scowl, his eyes tired and deeply cynical. He looked down at Jamal, then at Imani, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his features. To him, this was just another case clogging up his docket. Another waste of taxpayer money. His bias was a palpable force in the room, leaning so heavily toward the prosecution and the police that it warped the very air. Officer Miller took the stand, radiating a smug confidence that was almost theatrical. He settled into the witness chair as if it were a comfortable armchair in his own living room. He placed his hands on the wooden rail, his decorated uniform practically humming with self-importance. He was the hero of this story, and he was ready to perform the assistant district attorney. A young, ambitious man named Peterson began his questioning. It was more of a coronation than an examination. He lobbed softball questions, allowing Miller to paint a vivid, heroic, and entirely fictitious narrative. "Officer Miller, could you please describe the events of the traffic stop?" Peterson asked, his tone reverent. Miller cleared his throat, his voice booming with authority. "I observed the defendant's vehicle with a non-operational taillight. I initiated a standard traffic stop for the safety of the public." He spoke in crisp, official jargon, the language of unimpeachable reports. "And what happened when you approached the vehicle?" The defendant was immediately hostile, Miller said, shaking his head with theatrical sadness. His body language was aggressive. I could smell alcohol on his breath. When I asked for his license and registration, he became belligerent, using profane language. A lie. Jamal didn't drink. Imani knew this. She sat perfectly still at the defense table, her pen moving silently across a yellow legal pad. She wasn't writing frantic notes. She was drawing a single intricate geometric shape, her focus absolute. It was a mental exercise, a way to channel her cold rage into pure, focused energy. Her heart rate remained a steady, calm 60 beats per minute. Miller continued, his story growing more elaborate with each sentence. He refused to comply with my lawful orders. When I asked him to step out of the vehicle, he shoved me. I feared for my safety and had to use necessary force to subdue him. He glanced at the jury, his eyes pleading for sympathy. He then assaulted me, striking me in the chest. Another lie. A bigger one. The only violence had been his own. From the gallery, a man in a perfectly tailored Italian suit, watched with a neutral expression. This was Marcus Vance, Imani's chief of staff from an office Miller couldn't possibly imagine. He caught her eye for a fraction of a second. His look was a question. "Are you sure about this? You can end this now." Imani gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Let him continue. The plan required Miller to build his own pyre, log by log. He needed to feel utterly invincible before she lit the match. Miller's testimony continued. A master class in performative victimhood. He described his supposed fear, the adrenaline, the struggle to control a crazed suspect. He was playing the part he had played 100 times before, and it had always worked. He saw the jury, a collection of tired, ordinary citizens nodding along. He saw the judge, already looking at Jamal with undisguised contempt. He felt the familiar surge of power, the intoxicating certainty of his own narrative. He glanced over at Imani. She was just sitting there doodling. The sheer disrespect of it, the quiet defiance began to needle him. He was a decorated officer of the law, a pillar of the community, and this woman, this nobody, was ignoring his grand performance. The arrogance that defined him began to curdle into anger. He decided to escalate, to put her and her thug client in their place so definitively that no one could question it. Peterson finished his direct examination. "Thank you, officer. No further questions." Judge Thompson turned his scowl toward Imani. "Your witness, counselor." The word counselor was laced with sarcasm. Imani stood slowly, leaving her notepad on the table. She walked toward the witness stand, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She didn't carry the file with her. She didn't need it. Every fact, every statute, every lie Miller had told was already perfectly indexed in her mind. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice soft, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "You have a commendable record, many citations for bravery." Miller puffed out his chest. "I do my job." He thought she was trying to flatter him, to soften him up. It was a rookie mistake. "And in your job, accuracy is paramount, is it not? An officer's report is a sacred document." "That's correct," he said, his confidence unwavering. "Every word in my report is the truth." This was the moment, the final escalation. Imani's quiet competence was an irritant under Miller's skin. He perceived her calm, probing questions, not as legal strategy, but as a personal attack on his authority, his very identity. He saw her composure as insolence. In his world, people like her were supposed to be flustered, emotional, and easily intimidated. Her refusal to play that role was an intolerable act of defiance. "Officer Miller," Imani continued, her tone still unnervingly level. "In your report you stated that you activated your body-worn camera the moment you stepped out of your patrol car. Is that correct?" Miller's eyes narrowed. This was the core of his fabricated evidence. "Yes, standard procedure. And that camera footage, which was submitted to the court, shows my client shoving you and then striking you. Correct?" "As clear as day," Miller sneered, leaning into the microphone. He glanced at the judge, a look of shared understanding passing between them. They both knew how this game was played. The word of a decorated officer against a kid from the wrong side of the tracks. The video just sealed the deal. He felt a surge of triumph. He was about to crush this little public defender. He would make an example of her and her client. He decided to twist the knife. "You know, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescending poison. "Maybe if your client learned some respect for the law, he wouldn't be in this mess. Some people are just born criminals." A gasp rippled through the gallery. The ADA Peterson winced. Judge Thompson, however, merely looked annoyed. At Imani, counselor, "Control the witness." he grumbled, as if Miller's outburst were her fault. This was the overreach. This was the bait swallowed whole. Miller, blinded by his own hubris and egged on by a biased system, had just made the definitive, unrecoverable error. He had publicly declared his prejudice and anchored his entire case to a piece of evidence he believed. He felt invincible, perched atop his mountain of lies. "So, to be perfectly clear, Officer Miller," Imani said, her voice dropping slightly, losing its gentle cadence and taking on a harder diamond edge, "you are testifying under oath that the video evidence submitted to this court is a complete and unaltered recording of the entire incident from the moment you exited your vehicle." Miller leaned forward, his face a mask of smug certainty. He felt the kill shot was imminent. He was going to bury them. "I am the law in this city," he said, his voice low and menacing, a clear threat. "And that video is the God's honest truth. Every single second of it." Imani paused. She let his words hang in the dead air of the courtroom, a monument to his own arrogance. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. In that moment, the entire dynamic of the room began to shift, to pivot on the invisible axis of her will. The prey was gone. A predator had taken her place. She turned away from him, addressing the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now calm, precise and utterly lethal, "the defense has a motion." A flicker of confusion crossed Miller's face. A motion? What could she possibly have? He had accounted for everything. He had the report, the video, the judge in his pocket. He had already won. Judge Thompson sighed, looking at the clock on the wall. "What is it, counselor? I hope this isn't a waste of the court's time." She walked back to the defense table, but instead of picking up a file, she retrieved a small, sleek tablet device. As she walked back toward the bench, the U.S. Marshals, who had been sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery, stood up in unison. 2 of them moved silently to cover the courtroom exits. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Miller's chest for the first time. Why were they moving? The power in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a tidal wave. The air crackled with a new, terrifying energy. Miller's smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a clammy, sickening dread. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. The hunter's instinct that had served him so well on the streets was now screaming at him that he was trapped. The room, once his kingdom, had become a cage. "Your Honor," Imani said, placing the tablet on the clerk's desk to be projected onto the courtroom screens. "The evidence submitted by the prosecution, specifically the body camera footage, has been forensically analyzed. A new image appeared on the screens, a waveform analysis of the video's audio track. It was covered in complex notations and timestamps. The footage is exactly 2 minutes and 14 seconds long," Imani stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "However, my client was detained on the roadside for over 12 minutes. The prosecution's video has been illegally edited. There are 9 minutes and 48 seconds missing." Slam! The word landed like a physical blow. Miller's face, already pale, drained of all color. He started to sweat profusely, his starched collar suddenly feeling like a noose. Impossible. He had personally overseen the clip he'd submitted. He'd cut out the part where he'd goaded Jamal, where he'd used a slur. Who was this woman? How could she possibly know? "Objection," the ADA stammered, scrambling to his feet. "Foundation? Speculation? Overruled," Judge Thompson snapped, his eyes now glued to the screen, his judicial curiosity finally overriding his bias. "Explain, counselor." "With pleasure, Your Honor," Imani said. She tapped the tablet, and a new file opened. It was a document, an official letterhead at the top. Miller couldn't read it from the stand, but he saw the seal, the eagle, The scales of justice. It was the seal of the United States Department of Justice. For the past 18 months, Imani announced, her voice resonating with an authority that dwarfed everyone in the room. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been conducting a federal investigation into the 15th Precinct for a pattern of civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. The lead prosecutor on that investigation, she reached into her simple blazer and produced a leather credential case. She flipped it open. "Assistant United States Attorney Imani Hayes," she said, the words cracking like a gunshot in the stunned silence. "And Officer Frank Miller has been our primary target." The courtroom erupted. The jury gasped. The ADA stumbled back, his face a mask of pure shock. Judge Thompson's jaw literally dropped. He stared at the unassuming woman in the cheap suit, and then at the credentials, his mind struggling to reconcile the two realities. Miller felt the floor drop out from under him. The world tilted on its axis, colors seeming to leach from his vision. A roaring sound filled his ears. A federal prosecutor. It wasn't possible. This was a trap of unimaginable complexity, and he had walked right into its center. "As part of our investigation," Imani continued, her voice a cold, surgical instrument, "we obtained the unedited source code from Officer Miller's body camera server. We have the full, unadulterated recording of the entire incident." She tapped the tablet again. A new video began to play on the screens. It was the missing 9 minutes. The courtroom watched in horrified silence. As the real events unfolded, they saw Miller's aggression, heard his slurs, witnessed his relentless goading of a terrified young man who was doing nothing but trying to remain calm. And then came the final, damning scene. Not from the traffic stop, but from the booking area, filmed by a hidden surveillance camera planted by Imani's own federal team weeks earlier. The video was crystal clear. It showed Miller shoving Jamal against the wall. It showed his face, contorted with rage, and it showed him spitting on Jamal. A wave of revulsion washed over the courtroom. The jury members looked physically ill. Judge Thompson rose halfway out of his seat, his face purple with fury, not at Jamal, but at the officer who had sat in his courtroom and lied with such breathtaking arrogance. He felt like a fool, a pawn in Miller's corrupt game, and his wrath was biblical. This is an outrage," the judge roared, pointing a trembling finger at Miller. "You disgrace that uniform. You disgrace this court." Marshals closed in on the witness stand. One of them produced a pair of handcuffs. Miller looked at them, then at Imani, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The world he had built, the system he had mastered and manipulated, was crumbling to dust around him. "You," he stammered, his voice a choked whisper, "you can't do this." Imani looked at him, her expression not triumphant, but weary, as if she were dealing with a tiresome but necessary piece of business. A voice dropped to that terrifyingly quiet register, a sound meant only for him, a final, perfectly placed blade. "You said you were the law," she said softly. "You were wrong." The marshals pulled him from the chair. They wrenched his arms behind his back, the sharp click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent room. They stripped the medals from his chest, unpinned his badge, and led him away, a fallen king being frog-marched from his own castle. His reign was over. His humiliation was absolute, public, and total. The fallout was a nuclear winter for Frank Miller and the 15th Precinct. The story didn't just go viral. It became a national symbol of corruption brought to light. Headlines screamed from every news outlet. "Hero Cop's lies, exposed by federal prosecutor, posing as public defender." "The Miller tapes." Full unedited footage shows years of abuse. "DOJ investigation decimates 15th Precinct command staff." Miller's life disintegrated with astonishing speed. His carefully constructed world was not just cracked, it was pulverized. He was immediately fired from the force, stripped of his pension and benefits after 22 years of service. The police union, seeing the irrefutable video evidence and the federal juggernaut aligned against him, publicly condemned his actions and dropped him from their legal protection plan. He was utterly, completely alone. The state charges against Jamal were dismissed with a scathing apology from Judge Thompson, who then personally reported Miller to the state bar for perjury. But that was the least of his worries. AUSA Imani Hayes unsealed a sprawling 112-page federal indictment. Miller was charged with perjury, obstruction of justice, falsifying government records, and multiple counts of deprivation of civil rights under color of law. His wife, a woman who had built her social standing on being married to a decorated police officer, filed for divorce within a week. The papers were served to him in his jail cell. His friends on the force, the ones he had covered for and who had covered for him, suddenly had no memory of his name. Faced with their own federal indictments, they scrambled to become cooperating witnesses, each one offering up another piece of Miller's corrupt history in exchange for a lighter sentence. With no income and facing astronomical legal bills, he was forced to declare bankruptcy. The court-appointed lawyer he was assigned was young, overwhelmed, and no match for the meticulous, perfectly constructed case Imani had built. The irony was a bitter pill. The man who had mocked public defenders was now desperately reliant on one. The system he had so expertly manipulated turned on him with a vengeance. Every corner he had cut was now an exhibit for the prosecution. Every lie he had ever told was now a nail in his own coffin. He took a plea deal, a humiliating confession, to all charges, to avoid spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. He was sentenced to 15 years, but the impact went far beyond one corrupt officer. Imani's investigation gutted the 15th precinct. The captain, 2 lieutenants, and a dozen other officers were indicted. The precinct was placed under a federal consent decree, forcing sweeping, systemic reforms. The city implemented new, transparent protocols for body camera footage, making it impossible to illegally edit or delete recordings. A corrupt system had not been entirely cleansed, but a significant cancer had been excised, painfully and publicly. Months later, sunlight streamed into a spacious corner office on the 27th floor of the federal building. The view was panoramic, a god's-eye perspective of the city that Frank Miller once believed he owned. Imani Hayes stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a simple mug of tea in her hands. She wore one of her own suits now, exquisitely tailored, a statement of quiet, earned power. Jamal sat on the leather sofa, no longer in a prison jumpsuit, but in a crisp shirt from his university bookstore. He was looking through brochures for the nation's top law schools. The charges had been expunged, and his scholarship was secure. The ordeal had changed him. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. Marcus Vance walked in, placing a thin file on Imani's vast mahogany desk. "The last of the plea agreements just came in," he said. "It's over. We got them all." Imani nodded, a small, sad smile on her lips. She looked out at the sprawling metropolis below, at the millions of lives unfolding in the concrete canyons. "A badge is supposed to be a shield for the people," she said softly, almost to herself. "Not a crown for a king. The moment they forget that, the moment they believe the power is theirs to abuse, they've already lost." She turned from the window, her expression serene but resolute. The fight against Frank Miller was over, but the larger battle for justice was a war without end. She placed her mug on the desk, picked up the new file, and got back to work. What an incredible story of patience, intelligence, and karmic justice. Imani Hayes proved that the most powerful weapon against a corrupt system is the truth, wielded with absolute precision. Officer Miller thought he was untouchable. But karma, in the form of a brilliant federal prosecutor in disguise, made sure he paid for every single one of his abuses. If you loved watching this arrogant bully get exactly what he deserved, please smash that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more stories like this one. Share this video with anyone who loves a satisfying story of karma and seeing justice served cold. Everyone deserves to see a villain get their public comeuppance. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily drama and revenge stories. You won't want to miss what we have coming up next. Let me know in the comments below, what would you have done if you were in Imani's shoes? What was the most satisfying part of Miller's downfall for you? I read all your comments. See you in the next video.